My name is Rafiq Muhammad. I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences here at CSUSB. And I am honored to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate our first annual Rabbi Hillel Cohn Endowed Lecture Series. For those of you who don't know, the Cohn Lecture Series will be an annual event featuring noted scholars with expertise and unique insights into the contemporary Jewish experience. As you probably gathered from the talk's title, the series was established at CSUSB in recognition of all of the wonderful contributions that Rabbi Hillel Cohn has made as a religious and community leader here in the Inland Empire. It also is worth noting that this marks the first time in the history of the entire California State University system that a rabbi has been so honored. So, I have a few more things to say before we get to the event's formal program, but I would be foolish if I didn't yield the floor to someone who signs my paychecks. So it is my great privilege and honor to introduce our president, CSUSB's fourth president, Dr. Tomas Morales. I just want to say, I've introduced him before, most of you know who he is, but I do just want to say a couple of things about Dr. Morales. I think he's done a wonderful job as our campus leader in a couple of ways that I'd just like to point out very quickly. Number one, I have never been around a campus leader who is more committed to students and student success than President Morales. And I think to the extent that, and it's frankly the only reason we're here is for the students, so to the extent that students drive what we do on a college campus, I've never met anyone more committed to ensuring that their needs are met. And so I'd like to recognize him for that. And also, I'd like to acknowledge President Morales for what what I know he has tried to do to create more opportunities like this on our campus, to have opportunities for us to engage intellectually on a college campus, because I think that's a critical part of campus life and college life, is to get folks from the community, folks from campus, students and friends and all kinds of people together to discuss issues that matter today. I think that's what college should be about, and that's real college learning, and that's what President Morales has been supportive of. So thank you and welcome, President Morales.
Thank you, Rafiq, for that very generous introduction. This is indeed very exciting for me as a boy who grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood in the Bronx and was a very active member of the Jewish Community Center on Staten Island when I was the president of the College of Staten Island. That's where I did my spinning classes with Devorah Lieberman, who's now the president of Laverne. So it's a really small higher education world. Good evening. It really is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to Cal State San Bernardino for tonight's launch of the Rabbi Hillel Cohn Lecture on the Contemporary Jewish Experience. This endowed series, established by our College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, is a tremendous addition to our campus community and this region. It is also a milestone event, making the first time, as our dean stated, in the long-esteemed history of the CSU system, that a rabbi has been so honored. We are proud to recognize Rabbi Cohn for his remarkable commitment to his congregation, the city of San Bernardino, the inland region, and of course to Cal State San Bernardino. For more, yes. For more than 6 decades, he has worked tirelessly to promote understanding, tolerance, and diversity, not just within the Jewish religion, but with all faiths. We are all truly blessed and a better people because of his dedication. I am delighted to announce that this June, we will confer Rabbi Cohn an honorary doctorate of humane letters during the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences commencement ceremony at Citizens Business Bank Arena. You are all invited. We'll have a really neat suite, so mark the date. For tonight's lecture, we are indeed privileged to have Rabbi David Ellenson as the initial speaker in this series, a renowned academic leader and scholar of Jewish religious thought, ethics, and modern Jewish history. Rabbi Ellenson is said to possess a rare combination of intelligence, inspirational leadership, and humility. He is a voice that is relevant and inspiring to people of all faiths and cultures. We are extremely grateful to have Rabbi Ellenson here to speak to us tonight. Again, thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, President Morales. Shortly, we will be joined by our inaugural speaker and distinguished guest, Rabbi David Ellenson. As you know, Dr. Ellenson is the Chancellor Emeritus of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion and Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. We were only able to have Dr. Ellenson join us this evening, and this series was only made possible through the generosity of literally dozens of donors. I was looking at the long list of folks, I was going to say scores, because it's in the 20s, like over and over again, of people who felt sincerely that in these dynamic and challenging times, it was critical for us as a community and a country to develop deeper understandings of the contemporary history, experiences, and contributions of Jewish Americans, as well as our Jewish brothers and sisters around the globe. In total, over $200,000 has been raised in a relatively short period of time to endow this lecture series, and to assure that CSUSB will be a leader in this conversation for years to come. I think 200 grand's worth a round of applause. While the list of donors, as I just said, is far too extensive for me to share with you in full, I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank a handful of people without whose exceptional generosity and moral support tonight wouldn't have been possible. They are Dr. Bernie Gohler, Nicholas Goldware, Stephen Becker, Elaine Rosen, Paul and Susan Scheimoff, Stater Brothers Markets, James Watson, Ellen and Stan Weiser, my predecessor, Dr. Jamel Nassar, there he is in the back like students, and Leona Arnoff Sadaka and Joe Sadaka. For those of you who don't know, Leona offered a lead gift of $100,000 to create this lectureship. I'd also very quickly like to thank Ron Fremont and the members of the CSUSB advancement team for pulling this all together. Thank you, Ron. I know it was a lot of work for you and your team. If it's like my office, it was a lot of work for my team, and I get all the credit. So thank you, Ron. Again, over $200,000 was raised to endow the speaker series, and we are still happy to accept donations if anyone's willing to give, so that we can keep this going. And of course, donors gave because they believed in the theme of the series. They were interested in supporting lectures on the contemporary Jewish experience. But if this were called the John Smith Endowed Lecture Series, I can assure you that we wouldn't be here tonight. People supported this series specifically, and I heard this 5 minutes ago. People supported this series specifically because of after whom it's named, Rabbi Hillel Cohn. Rabbi Cohn was truly one of the first people I met when I got to this campus a couple of years ago. My first day on the job, I was told, "Oh, you have a development council meeting tonight at 5:30," and I was like, "Huh? What? Who?" But the rabbi has served on our college's development council, and I also have worked with him with a group called Moral McCombs that's devoted to developing interfaith understanding in the region. And it has truly been a privilege to have worked with the rabbi for the past couple of years and to get to know him to the extent that I have. For those of you who don't know, I presume most of you do, that Rabbi Hillel Cohn served as rabbi of Congregation Emmanuel in San Bernardino from 1963 to 2001. If I continued to read his list of accolades and accomplishments, we would be here all night, and Dr. Ellenson would have come out here for no reason, because we wouldn't get to his talk. So I will just be brief. Suffice it to say that Rabbi Cohn has dedicated his life to tolerance and to helping those who have been persecuted due to their race, religion, or political views. The impact of his work has been felt throughout the Inland Empire and well beyond. Rabbi Cohn has been a tireless force for helping people in our community and has served as a beacon of hope in a region that's been neglected and in a world fraught with injustice and prejudice. Where there is difference, he finds common ground. Where there is dissension, he's helped foster understanding and compromise. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Rabbi Hillel Cohn.
I am deeply honored by the presence of so many of you who have come to celebrate the establishment of the endowed annual lecture on the contemporary Jewish experience, which bears my name, and welcome to all of you. It's a great source of personal pride that this annual educational experience will bring to this university, either here on the main campus or to the desert campus, scholars of note who will lecture on various facets of the Jewish experience. And this cannot help but expand the knowledge of the Jewish experience and increase the respect for that experience by those who will attend these annual lectures. It's been my privilege to see this university grow into the fine academic institution it is today. And this growth has far exceeded the expectations of those of us who gathered here in 1963 to hear the then newly selected first president, Dr. John Fau, and his associates describe their vision of what this campus would become. And when the first classes opened a couple of years after that, here on this wind-swept, empty space, with a small but highly impressive faculty, it was but the beginning of what has become a steady growth, today serving close to 20,000 students. It was a little more than 2 years ago that the then dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, my friend Dr. Jamal Nassar, and the development director at the time, Brent Hunter, began exploring ways in which the then planned forthcoming 50th anniversary of the establishment of this university could be marked, especially by the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And out of these discussions came the idea of establishing an endowment fund which would make possible an annual lectureship on some facet of Judaism. And while the 50th anniversary is now come and gone, the effort began, and tonight's inaugural lecture is the result of these efforts. I'm humbled and extraordinarily proud that this endowment was created in my honor, and I have a number of people to thank for their part in creating this program. They've already been mentioned, but let me take a few moments to mention them additionally. First and foremost is my dear, dear friend, Leona Aronoff Sadaka, who responded with such enthusiasm and generosity to the idea of creating this annual lectureship. There is no way that I can ever fully express to you, Leona, my love and affection, my gratitude for all that you have done here at the Hebrew Union College and at Congregation Emmanuel honoring me. This program, the Scholarship Fund at the Hebrew Union College, and the naming of a wing at the new building of Congregation Emmanuel, all bearing my name, are far, far more than I merit. So let me ask all of you to join in expressing appreciation to Leona. Leona, will you stand? Leona, stand up for a moment. After receiving the wonderful commitment of Leona to contribute $100,000, a group of 3 marvelous, wonderful couples, all dear friends, were brought together to embark on the effort to secure the funds that would match Leona's commitment. Vicki and Steve Becker, Susan and Paul Scheimoff, and Ellen and Stan Weiser took on that challenge. And they each came forth with their own generous commitment, and then they sought the participation of others, and they succeeded, as you have heard, in raising the funds that would match the original gift and make possible the establishment of the endowment fund that will make the annual lectureship conducted in perpetuity. I want to express my gratitude and my affection, my love for the Beckers, the Scheimoffs, and the Weisers. Please join me in thanking them. If you'd stand for a moment. Steve, where are you? And to all those who generously gave of their resources to ensure the viability of the fund, my deep appreciation. I do want to thank particularly Dr. Jamal Nassar for his taking the lead along with Brent Hunter in establishing this. Thank you very much, Jamal. And I also want to thank the leadership of the university for their efforts in making this possible. Now my good friend, Dr. Tomas Morales, Vice President of University Advancement, Ron Fremont, Dean Rafiq Muhammad, and their staffs have been most instrumental and supportive in this project. And while the endowment fund and the annual program bears my name, I believe that it is really an expression of the respect that this community, the wider community, has for the Jewish people, for the congregation that I served, and I would say for my clergy colleagues, the clergy of all faiths in the Inland Empire. While there are so many others to thank, let me add one more very personal expression of gratitude to my supportive wife and partner, Rita, Rita received both her undergraduate degree as well as her master's degree from the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences here. She's a proud alumna of this institution and for many years served in the financial aid office, and her retirement was the associate director of financial aid here on this campus. It's my fervent hope that each year, as scholars of note are brought here to share their perspectives on any one of the many facets of the contemporary Jewish experience, that they will bring enlightenment of the mind and enrichment of the soul to those who, like you tonight, will avail themselves of the opportunity to become more conversant with the Jewish experience and, above all, to cherish the rich diversity which is one of the great blessings of this community and of our nation. And now it's my distinct honor and privilege and pleasure to introduce the inaugural lecturer of the Rabbi Hillel Cohn Endowed Lecture on the Contemporary Jewish Experience. And I'm so honored that he accepted our invitation to be with us and to share with us his remarkable gifts of mind and spirit. This is not the first time that Rabbi David Ellenson has spoken in this community. It was perhaps 30 years ago or so that he, then a young teacher in the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, came to Congregation Emmanuel, which was then not too far down the street here on 35th and E, on a Sunday morning, to speak to a group of adults on what, if I recall correctly, was the evolution of liberal or Reformed Judaism with special emphasis on the roots of Reformed Judaism and its liturgy. Over the years, we have shared a wonderful friendship, and I've been so impressed with his many accomplishments. In 2001, he assumed the presidency of my beloved seminary, the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, probably the only institution that has a longer name than California State University, San Bernardino, with its 4 campuses in Cincinnati, New York, Los Angeles, and Jerusalem. Dr. Ellenson's academic achievements are exceptional. He received his BA degree from the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and then went on to receive a master's degree from the University of Virginia and another master's degree from Columbia University. He attended the Hebrew Union College, our common alma mater, where he was ordained as a rabbi in 1977, and then received his PhD from Columbia University in 1981. In 1979, he joined the faculty of the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, where he was for so many years a beloved, highly respected teacher. From 2001 to 2013, he served as president of Hebrew Union College and today is its chancellor emeritus. Not one to retire, something that we share in common, he now serves as the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies and visiting professor in the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. Rabbi Ellenson has authored or edited 7 or more books and over 300 articles and reviews in a wide variety of academic and popular journals, and has received numerous well-deserved awards. I could say much more about my dear friend and teacher and colleague, Rabbi David Ellenson, but let me just say that in addition to being brilliant, he is one of the most decent, loving human beings that I've ever known. I'm so honored that he is here to deliver the inaugural lecture, so please join me in welcoming Rabbi David Ellenson.
I think that was a fair introduction that you gave me. Seriously, I'm very, very touched and moved and very, very grateful and delighted to be here. 2 observations I would make. Let me say a few words before I begin to speak. First, I would say, Dean Muhammad, you are probably on your way to becoming actually college president at some point, because I noted that in your introductory remarks, you also made a request for additional funds while you were thanking everyone else. I think, as President Morales would tell you, this is really certainly a good sign that beyond all of your other obvious intellectual and personal qualities and capabilities, a talent that college presidents are required to have. To President Morales, I want to thank you for welcoming me here to Cal State San Bernardino. I do want to give you one warning, though. I am actually very, very, very delighted that Rabbi Cohn will receive the honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters at your graduation this year. But you should know, and many people have observed, that in fact Judaism became sick when rabbis became doctors. But I have to also point out you are not the first one, because in fact the Hebrew Union College a number of years ago also was honored to bestow the honorary Doctor of Divinity degree upon Rabbi Cohn. So for all of you who are his friends and who love him as I do, you can now address him as Rabbi Doctor Doctor. And if you don't think that's enough, you can simply refer to him as either His Eminence or His Holiness. But we will be sure to honor you in an appropriate way. And Rita, of course, you can call Hillel whatever you want. I do want to say that it really is a great honor to be here, and I I do want to reiterate what the president and dean said about Rabbi Cohn, and to thank Leona and Joe and everyone else who made this lectureship possible. There are individuals, and I speak now as a rabbi, not as an academic, who are rabbis, who model for all of us who are in the pulpit and who aspire for our rabbinates to embody the absolute best of what it is the Jewish tradition can possibly embody. Issues of knowledge. Whoops. Can they not hear? Or? I don't think there's really a slideshow, but what is it we're doing right now? Can you just not hear?
No, they want to wake it up.
What?
They wanted to wake it up.
Okay.
Let me try this one more time here.
I thought maybe my picture wasn't quite large enough. Okay. There we go. Is that better? Okay. There are reasons why so many of us love you. On a personal level, a rabbi is required to fulfill really three functions. One, a rabbi is required to be, as the Sephardic tradition puts it in Judaism, a marbitz Torah, someone who in fact is the embodiment of and teaches Torah. Knowledge has to be at the very base of who and what a rabbi is, and a rabbi has to be willing to share that Torah with everyone whom he or she touches or meets. And Hillel, you have really done this throughout your career. You've done it in your pulpits. You've done it through your work at the Central Conference of American Rabbis. You have never forgotten your own roots as a refugee in this country, brought over here as an infant by your parents. And I think all of us are really indebted to you for the Torah that you teach. A rabbi, though, also has to be a chaver. A rabbi has to be a friend. A rabbi has to have the ability to feel the joys, the pains, the wonders, the challenges that are really part of someone's life. Without empathy, a rabbi really cannot function in his or her role. And I think no one is really a better chaver, a better friend, a better colleague, someone who empathizes more than you. And finally, a rabbi has to be a chacham. A rabbi has to be wise. We were talking earlier tonight, and I made the comment. We were talking about how there are some people on the political scene whose names I won't mention, who sometimes express every thought, it seems, that they have. My mother's line used to be, you actually don't have to say everything you're thinking. And sometimes, shtika yafa mizahav, silence, is actually better than what it is that you might express. But you have to have, and this is an old French word that I'm sure many of you know, it's called seichel. Seichel just means common sense. You have to have wisdom, and Hillel, you embody all these qualities. You are a person who teaches Torah, you are a friend to all of us, and you're a person who models what it is to be in the world and how to behave in a prudent and a wise and a judicious and a caring way. So for all of these reasons, when you called and the dean followed up to ask if I would come to do this lecture, I was just frankly honored and overwhelmed that you would have thought of me, and I am delighted to be here tonight with all of you. With that said, at this juncture, I want to turn from simply being Rabbi Cohen's friend and even being a rabbi to hopefully being an academic. And what I'd like to do over the next 35 to 45 minutes, I will say, and I suspect and I know there are a number of professors here. When I first applied to the Hebrew Union College, and I was told that classes were an hour and a half, I used to wonder, and I was actually quite frightened. I thought, well, what could I say for 90 minutes? Then, of course, I began to teach. And as I'm sure is true with many of your teachers here, once I began to teach, frankly, 90 minutes could really not even begin to contain all of the wisdom and knowledge that I had to share. But I won't go for 90 minutes tonight, I promise you that. But I hope over the next 35 to 45 minutes I can talk about where the American Jewish community is today, where we are in terms of being, I think, for reasons I hope to explain, a crossroads. I want to do this by placing the American Jewish experience in historical context, both internally, in terms of that which occurs within the Jewish community, but I want to also indicate that the Jewish community in North America, and indeed throughout our history, is never hermetically sealed off. That is to say, ways in which the American Jewish community operates and the challenges that we confront and the opportunities that lie before us are part really of a larger American tapestry. One of the great problems in Jewish studies, and I think this may be true of other ethnic studies as well, but I'll just focus on Jewish studies. Jews and anti-Semites have one major thing in common. Each thinks that Jews are at the absolute center of the world. As one of my friends, and I grew up in Newport News, Virginia, once put it to me, a non-Jewish friend, he said, "David, I know you may not believe this, but he said there actually are billions of people on this globe who get up every morning, they go through the whole day, the week, the month, they live their lives," and he said they actually do not think for one moment about Jews, Judaism, or the state of Israel. I, by the way, don't believe that's true, because what else would people think about? But it is a humbling kind of thought, and part of what I do want to do tonight is, as I talk about the Jewish community and where we are today, is to try to indicate how some of the trends that we have in North American Jewry today reflect larger trends in American society. And finally, what I hope to be able to do then is to make, I hope, some informed assessments, predictions about directions in which the American Jewish community will move. By the way, I like this part the best because whatever predictions I provide cannot at this moment be empirically disconfirmed. Of course, they might not be able to be empirically confirmed either, but we'll try to move ahead. So let me talk then about where the Jewish community is today, and let me start by talking then a little bit about the history of the American Jewish community. And I want to do this by giving you a 5 to 8 minute encapsulated vision of the demography of the American Jewish community and its organization prior really to the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the 20th century. First Jews came to the United States in 1654. There were 21 Jews who fled from Recife in Brazil. They came to New Amsterdam, which later became New York City. These were people who were fleeing from the Inquisition. So the first Jews to come to these shores were refugees who were of Sephardic descent. They escaped religious persecution. By the end of the colonial period and the beginning of the early Federalist period in North America, in what would become the United States of America in 1790, the only time, by the way, where a census counted religion, there were 3,000 Jews who lived in North America. So out of a population of approximately 9 million people, you had 3,000 Jews, most of them of Sephardic descent, so that the Jewish community in the United States goes back to 1654, but it was a tiny community, and the community was located on the eastern seaboard, all in port cities. And the Sephardic Jews, Jews of Spanish descent, were the Jews who dominated in the Jewish community during that period. From 1815 to 1881, approximately 225,000 Jews came to the United States. Virtually all of them came from Central Europe. In 1789, after the French Revolution, and in every territory that Napoleon conquered, Jews were politically emancipated. Jews were politically emancipated, and they were permitted to be individual citizens of the modern nation state. As you know from your classes here in European Jewish history, the French Revolution becomes a genuine revolution when the estates are dissolved. Prior to that, people only had corporate identity. It made no sense to speak of people as being an individual citizen of a modern nation state. Rather, your political status, your cultural status was determined by the group to which you belonged. With the French Revolution, the Jews were emancipated and allowed to participate as equals in theory in European society. Of course, Napoleon was defeated, and after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and these are important data to understand the directions of the American Jewish community, the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore the status quo in Europe as it had been prior to the French Revolution, so that rights that were extended to Jews, where they could enter any profession, were rescinded. As a result, between 1815 and 1848, many Jews in Central Europe experienced tremendous disappointment in the failure of political emancipation and a neutral society in Europe to be genuinely recognized. And over, or almost 250,000 of these people came to the United States. What this means is that the Jews who came to North America in the 19th century were people who were Western in their orientation. They spoke a Western language, German, and they had tasted, not water, but they had tasted the first fruits of emancipation. They had great and high expectations. It was a community that was desirous of acculturating into and participating in life in this country at the same time that these Jews wanted to retain their identity as Jews, but they were also a culturally homogeneous group. By the way, these Jews were joined by millions of other people from Ireland and from Central Europe and other places. Remember, America had purchased the Louisiana Territory, and without getting into great detail, you had also an industrial revolution. America was anxious to bring immigrants in, and if I can say this, particularly immigrants who were white during this period in order to settle all of these Western territories. During this period, one immigrant who came over was a man named Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. Ultimately, he ended up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati, in the 1850s and 60s, was to the United States what Chicago became in the 20th century. Namely, prior to the railroad, the way west was to go through the Ohio River and Cincinnati, Ohio. For that reason, in 1870, Cincinnati, Ohio had 30,000 Jews. New York City had 30,000 Jews. They were the two largest Jewish communities in North America. By the way, things have changed a little bit. So the Bronx neighborhood, President Morales, where you grew up, give or take, there are about 2 million Jews who live in New York today, and there are 30,000 Jews who live in Cincinnati, Ohio. But that is why the Hebrew Union College was established there, the seminary that both Rabbi Cohn and I attended, because Cincinnati was a major center, a metropolitan center of American Jewish life. Rabbi Wise believed that American Judaism could not grow and could not prosper without a seminary that would educate rabbis to provide leadership for the community. And keep in mind, you had no national organizations of any type whatsoever that were of any significance. Wise became the most significant rabbi in the United States. He created a prayer book called the Minhag America, the American Custom. At one point, this prayer book was used by 80% of the congregations in the United States. He created the Hebrew Union College, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He believed that he could unite all of America's Jews, and he nearly succeeded. But then 1881 came, and 1881 is a significant year because what is it that occurs in Russia during this period? What begins to happen? This is not a rhetorical question, someone may know. You begin to have pogroms. You begin to have pogroms, and between 1881 and 1924, 2 million Jews come to the United States. 2 million Jews come to the United States. So you have a community that went from being minuscule during the Federalist and early colonial periods to having a significant population, but one that was culturally homogeneous, and suddenly you had Eastern European Jews who came. The Eastern European Jews, people like my grandparents, and I want to be respectful, but also descriptive. They were the best people in the world, could not be more wonderful. They were not Western in their orientation. They had not been exposed to a Western language. The language they spoke was Yiddish. My grandparents, all of whom were immigrants to this country from Eastern Europe, spoke what I would call at the end of their lives, at least to me, Yinglish. Namely, it was Yiddish with some English interspersed in it. These people were culturally radically different than the German Jews who came here before them. And the idea of creating a bond of union that Isaac Mayer Wise had dreamed of between German, or between all the Jews, or among all the Jews in the United States, perished after 1881, not because of a great theological debate, but rather because there was a cultural split between the Eastern European and the German Jews. In 1883, the Hebrew Union College, after 200,000 of these Eastern European Jews came, had its first ordination, and you have then one of the most famous or infamous events in American Jewish history that occurs. The Hebrew Union College celebrated its ordination of its first class of rabbis by having a banquet that has gone down in history, and it is known as the Treifa banquet. The Treifa banquet. Treif means impure, unkosher, unfit food. From the standpoint of elite Jewish teaching, food is either kosher or non-kosher. But from a sociological perspective, I want to distinguish between what I call high treif and low treif. High treif would mean, let's go to McDonald's, put on a Big Mac, put cheese, shrimp, I don't know, any other non-kosher food you could imagine. Low treif is, so let me eat chicken or a hamburger. If the food had been prepared in an appropriate way, the meat in and of itself might not have inherently been non-kosher. At this meal, every bit of non-kosher food you can imagine was served. Many historians will claim this was a caterer's error. I now speak as someone who's a former college president. I find that hard to believe. I think, in effect, a message was being given. The German Jews were saying to the Eastern Europeans, and this was the impact of it, Judaism is a religion of universal moral values striving to be in accord with the highest postulates of reason. It is not about ritual matters like what kind of food you're going to put into your stomach. And then in 1885, the Reform movement wrote a platform in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Platform that said precisely that. It was at that moment that the conservative movement was born in the United States. If this were a class in American Jewish history, I would go all over this in detail, but this is the key point that should emerge. For the German Jews who came here, the movement that emerged with which they identified was the Reform movement. The Reform movement, how many of you here in this room remember there was a Reform prayer book called the Union Prayer Book? How many of you remember it? Fervently we pray that the day will come when superstition shall no longer enslave the mind, nor idolatry blind the eye. It was during this point that the Reform movement began to do almost all of its liturgy in English. It removed head coverings for men during prayer, and it removed prayer shawls. If you did not want my grandfather to attend a synagogue, you didn't have to put a sign up, we don't want Eastern European Jews. For someone like my grandfather to go and pray from a book that would be in English, not in Hebrew, not to be able to wear a head covering or a prayer shawl, it was not going to be a place where someone like my grandfather would go. Reform Judaism became the folk Judaism of German Jews in this country. The conservative movement became the folk movement of Eastern European Jews, because one other point I want to make. People like my grandparents may not have been well educated in terms of secular or even perhaps classical yeshiva subjects. But just like the German Jews, and this is important to note, they desired to acculturate. when Eastern European Jews, like my grandparents, and I don't know how this happened, my paternal grandparents ended up in 1910 in Newport News, Virginia. If you've seen Hidden Figures, seriously, that is the community I grew up in. Imagine that community with an Orthodox shul. I don't know really quite how it happened. But my grandparents sent my father to the College of William and Mary and then Harvard Law School. The Fortis family, when it went to Memphis, Tennessee, sent Abe Fortis, who became a justice of the United States Supreme Court, to Southwestern at Memphis, and then Yale Law School. The Goldberg family, when it came to Chicago, sent Arthur Goldberg to Northwestern Law School, where he graduated as valedictorian at 21. The Eastern European Jews, like the German Jews before them, were desirous of acculturation. They simply couldn't do it in one generation, but their children and grandchildren did. What this meant was that for most of the 20th century, the largest single movement in North American Judaism was the conservative movement, because the conservative movement put forth a vision of Jewish tradition with which Eastern European Jews were comfortable, but on the other hand, it modernized. Men and women sat together. There was decorum during prayer. The Orthodox movement was the smallest of the movements by 1950 and 1960, and in terms of the educational and social and economic status of congregational members, it went from Reform to conservative to Orthodox. Now, as Jews began to acculturate, many of them, by the way, began to join Reform congregations so that rituals that had been discarded, for example, bar mitzvah, was not celebrated in Reform congregations for the first part of the 20th century. But as Eastern European Jews began to enter into Reform synagogues, things like the wearing of yarmulkes, head coverings, kippot, or introducing more Hebrew into prayer, ceremonies like bar bat mitzvah, some observance of Jewish dietary laws, all of these things occurred. By 1990, when a newish Jewish national population study took place, of the 1.4 million people who identified as Reform Jews in 1990, over 700,000 said they had grown up in conservative Jewish homes, which now brings me to the other point. Just to summarize, what all of this history is about is that you had an evolution of the Jewish community. There was a desire to create a culturally homogeneous one. There was an aspiration that could have been realized in the 19th century, impossible in the 20th century, because the ethnic divide between Eastern European and German Jews was a Grand Canyon. These people simply could not be together at that point, and conservative and Reform Judaism emerged as a result. By the 60s, 70s, and 80s, things began to change because you began to have the children and grandchildren of Eastern European immigrants, as well as the German Jews who had preceded them, dominate the population in the United States. And at this moment, to be able to tell who grew up with Eastern European grandparents or German grandparents, by the time you get to third and fourth generation, these differences basically disappear. Jews begin to be thoroughly acculturated. And the 60s and 70s witness some significant changes. One of the things that begins to result at the end of the 1960s is that for the first time, and I'm at a university, so first I'll use the academic term and then I'll put it in English, you begin to have a high rate of Jewish exogamy. That just means intermarriage. But I like using terms like exogamy and endogamy. I did my doctorate actually in sociology of religion, and actually at UCLA, I taught a class in intermarriage in North America. By the way, in North America, there's only one group that has a higher rate of exogamy than Jews do today. I just thought I'd throw this into you. Indian Hindus have a higher rate of intermarriage than North American Jews do. They have the highest rate of intermarriage for any minority group in the United States. We could talk about that at another time, but this is the key point. For any minority group to have a high rate of intermarriage, have to be two variables. Members of the minority group have to be thoroughly acculturated into the mores of the majority, and the majority has to view these people as desirable marriage partners. For there to be a high sociological incidence of this. In 1970, 30% of Jews married in the 1960s married people born non-Jewish. We're going to talk about the crossroads, and I want you to keep this in mind. By 1990, it raised to 52%, and in the most recent Pew study, 80% of people raised in Reform Jewish homes between 2001 and 2013 married people who were born non-Jewish. Over 60% of people who grew up in conservative Jewish homes married people who were born non-Jewish. So we talk about the crossroads. This is one major difference in American Jewish life in 2016 from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had a community that was endogamous, in-married, both because non-Jews wouldn't then marry Jews, and Jews had, frankly, a taboo against marrying non-Jews. But you had a community that was inherently endogamous, and a community that by and large belonged to a congregation, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. By 2017, you have a community that is overwhelmingly intermarried, or if I put it again in academic terms, the Jewish community today is ethnically, racially heterogeneous. It is not homogeneous. I do not know the population now of your temple here in San Bernardino, but if your temple was a significant representative of any synagogue that you would go to in the United States that wasn't Orthodox today, at least half of the children, if not more, in your religious school will have non-Jewish grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and that was not true 50 and 60 years ago. That is just a significant difference. So keep in mind when we talk about the crossroads, and the question is, does the community view this as a challenge or an opportunity? But you do have a racially and ethnically much more heterogeneous Jewish world today than you had previously. Now let's put this in the context, a larger context of the United States. And here I want to draw on the work of a sociologist named Peter Berger. Berger is, in my view, really the preeminent sociologist of religion in the United States. He is prolific in his writings, and I borrow upon them a great deal in trying to establish frameworks for my own understanding. He himself is a Lutheran. He is a German immigrant to this country. He doesn't write specifically on Jews, but I would apply what he says to Jews, but also other peoples. I want to mention two of his books that were written in the 70s. One book is entitled The Heretical Imperative. The Heretical Imperative. He points out that the word heresy, from which the adjective heretical comes from, has as its Greek etymological root the word heresis. Heresis means choice or option. The nature of the world we live in, he attempts to claim, is one where choices and options increase at a dizzying pace and they are inescapable. The nature of a traditional society is that you believe there is really only one way in which life can be led. The nature of a world that is marked by the dominance of an heretical imperative is that there are all kinds of pluralistic options. When I was a boy growing up in Newport News, Virginia, I did not know one Jew who did not belong to a synagogue, who did not give money to the United Jewish Appeal, who didn't belong to the Jewish Community Center. Not one of my friends was there even one divorce. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable today to think about how different this world was and the world I live in today. If you were gay, there was only one place to live, and that was in the closet. In this age, I have been the president of a seminary that was the first to ordain women in the United States. I mean, if I were to describe this, my father was Orthodox. He was not overwhelmingly happy when I elected to go to the Hebrew Union College. Think of a fundamentalist Baptist, and then they had a child who said, you know what, I'm going to become a Unitarian. My father was not overjoyed. But if you had said to him in 1960, David was going to become a Reform and not an Orthodox rabbi, he would have said, which he did say, I'm not happy about that, but he could imagine it. Rabbi Cohn didn't mention that I am not only a rabbi, but I am a Rebbitzin. That is to say, I am the spouse of a rabbi. My wife is a rabbi. If you had told my father in 1960 that I was going to marry a rabbi, well, there were no women rabbis. He couldn't have imagined it. The world has changed quite radically. So I am now head of a seminary, or was head of a seminary that ordains women, that proudly ordains GLBTQ persons, that demands equality for all peoples. The point I'm attempting to make here is not to have a discussion about how you feel about any of these issues. It is to illustrate what Berger's talking about. The nature of the world we live in is one in which change occurs at a dizzying kind of pace. Modernity is the solvent in which tradition dissolves. Modernity is the solvent in which tradition dissolves. I cannot help but imagine that there are many students that you have here at Cal State who are children of Mexican and other immigrants and residents here. Let's see them in another generation or two as they've gotten this kind of education and they become thoroughly acculturated into the United States, what their ethnic and other patterns are. Which brings me to Berger's other book. Berger then writes a book entitled The Homeless Mind, The Homeless Mind. In a world marked by the heretical imperative, part of what occurs is that tradition dissolves. And part of what that does mean is that in the world in which I grew up, in which I could assume that all Jews would affiliate, it's probably hard to believe, but there are Jews who actually don't belong to synagogues and don't give to federations and don't really participate in Jewish life. In addition, for the Jewish community, you have a tremendous issue of demographic mobility, so that Los Angeles, California in 1950 had approximately 50,000 Jews. Today, 600,000. Phoenix in 1970, 30,000 Jews, over 200,000 today. Dallas, Miami, Denver, Colorado. I don't know what the populations are here in the Inland Empire, but I can tell you, as Rabbi Cohn said, I lived here for over 20 years. And today, when Michelle drove me around and showed me this campus, Cal State San Bernardino did not look 20 years ago like it looks today. And I have to frankly say, the Inland Empire didn't look like it looked to me today. This world has radically changed. Part of what it means then is that for the Jewish community, you have record numbers of people who do not affiliate. Because unlike the child I was, where I grew up in Newport News and my father had 5 brothers and sisters and we all lived on the same street. So it meant that there were traditional, associational, and kinship patterns that would reaffirm how I would live in the world. If Yom Kippur came, and I, of course, would never not go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, but if it even occurred to me not to, I can promise you that 3 of my aunts and uncles, well, it would have been unthinkable. It wouldn't have had anything to do with how I felt about anything. It would just be the way I would have been in the world. When you move to Denver and you live in a world, it used to be reach out and touch someone, meant that you talk to them on the phone. I don't know how my students do it today, where reach out and touch someone means, I guess, I don't know, you have online communities. I think online communities are wonderful things, but I still have a hard time with that. I kind of like to see people in the flesh, but I know that we live in a different world. There are different ways in which people communicate today and in which community is formed. And people who had institutions like this have to be mindful of it. But part of what happens then, and these are the antipodian trends you have in American life. Remember, the antipodes are when on a battery you have currents moving in equal but opposite directions. Part of what modernity has done to the Jewish community is that it has led to its attenuation in terms of its formal membership. But on the other hand, the other thing that occurs, and this is the interesting part, is that people go to Phoenix or San Bernardino or Los Angeles, and they leave their home of origin, and what they seek is community. What was that TV show that used to be on? Cheers. Where do you remember what the song said at the beginning of that show about the Boston bar? They want to go somewhere where what? Everybody knows my name. People still have a human need for community. Human beings are individuals, but human beings are also social. They want to live in community. Therefore, what is the challenge? And this is the irony, is you have record numbers of people in the North American Jewish community who participate in Jewish life at a deeper and more significant level than had ever been thought before. Who would think that you'd have a lecture in Jewish studies at Cal State San Bernardino? By the way, in the 60s, you begin to get African American studies, Hispanic studies, women's studies. Look at the history that I took when I was a boy. I can tell you world history. There was a guy named Abraham. He lived in a place called the Fertile Crescent, and he gave the world ethical monotheism. Frankly, that was it for the Jews. That was it. Then you move to Greece and Rome. You then move to the birth of Christianity. You move to the Middle Ages. What were the Middle Ages called in almost every course people of my generation took? The Dark Ages. By the way, if you lived in a medieval Islamic world, I don't think they'd be called the Dark Ages. You then move to the rise of mercantilism, capitalism, etc., and if you were lucky, you went on. Note who isn't in the story. Jews aren't in the story, minorities aren't in the story, women aren't in the story, because that's not the story. By the way, I still think you can learn things from dead white European males. I happen to believe in that very, very much. But I think you can learn from other people as well. So part of what you need to note is, and this is the crossroads, what begins to happen is that for Jews, as for other groups, we experience the homelessness that Berger talks about, but it also leads to a greater sense of identity on the part of other Jews as well. By the time you get to the Pew study, by the way, the recent Pew study showed that in this world marked by a homeless mind, North Americans are seekers. Only 24% of people living in the United States belong to the religious denomination into which they were born. 76% of North Americans belong to religious traditions or identify with elements in those traditions that were not the traditions that they were raised in their childhood. By the way, I am just curious, how many of you belong to the same denomination or tradition in which you were born? How many of you have joined different ones? Well, you can see here it's about 50-50. But it's an interesting figure, so that what's occurred in the North American Jewish community is somewhat similar to what's occurred in the larger world. In the Pew study, we've talked about intermarriage. Now I want to talk about issues of denominationalism and identity. The largest growing group of North American Jews are what we call the nuns, not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S. They don't identify with any denomination in Judaism. Part of what you need to note is that in light of how I began this lecture, that Eastern European German Jewish cleavage is just over. Therefore, the sociological factors that led to the growth of the Reform and conservative movements and the desire for acculturation, those variables simply do not exist. Jews, by and large, are highly acculturated, And the distinctions between the Reform and Conservative movement on a sociological level are virtually non-existent. So in the recent Pew study, the largest denomination of American Jews, about 35%, identify as Reform, 18%, down almost 25% from 1990, identify as Conservative, and you have about 10%, 12% who identify as Orthodox, but I want to get to that in a moment, and the rest just say no denomination or none. There are even over 1 million Jews in America in the Pew study, almost 2 million, who when asked, are you Jewish, say, yes, I am Jewish, and when asked, is your religion Judaism, they say no. From the standpoint of an elite religious leader, now I'll speak as a rabbi, that is completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. It is intolerable. Now I'll speak as a sociologist. It is just a datum. I mean, an anecdote that I would tell, the Hebrew Union College does not admit intermarried students to its rabbinical program. I was called by the Jewish Forward to ask about our policy on this issue. This was 2003 or 4. I will confess to you, and I am now 69 years old, I didn't know we had a policy. I said, oh, do we really have that as a policy? And he read what was part of our literature. And I would say now as a president, you don't want your president to get caught with something like that, being unknowledgeable. But this is why it didn't even make sense to me. I asked a reporter, I said, I'm not opposed to that policy, but why would someone want to become a rabbi and be married to a non-Jew? I'm not talking about people intermarrying, but if you're going to be a rabbi, and this is the major way in which you view your vocation in the world, wouldn't you want your spouse to be Jewish? And the answer is apparently no, in some instances. But I was a little taken aback by that. I mean, I just offer it as a sign of confession here. So that part of what you need to note is that the recent Pew study reflects larger trends towards secularization in North American life in general. Jews are not unique, but it also means that part of the crossroads is the community is radically different today than it was. But now I want to point out to one of Berger's more recent works. Berger and Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, wrote a book called, in 1999, The Re-Enchantment of the World. The Re-Enchantment of the World. And Berger has pointed out that he was sort of wrong in the 1970s. He assumed that the whole world was going to be more and more secularized. But what's happened is the world has also become re-enchanted. That is to say, traditional religion not only has survived, but in fact it thrives all over the globe, and the truth is that it occurs in the Jewish community as well. So that while I said the Orthodox population is only about 10 to 12% of all Jews, the birth rate for non-Orthodox Jewish couples, according to the most recent Pew study, is 1.7 children. The Jewish community is not even repopulating itself in the non-Orthodox sector. Because many non-Jews come into the community, it continues to grow. But the average birth rate is 1.7. In the Orthodox community, the average birth rate is 4.1 children. 4.1. Also, in a recent study done in New York City of children being educated below the age of 18, 64% belong to Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox communities. What this means is, and now we get to the future, by the year 2030, 2040, the Orthodox community is going to be a much stronger element of the totality of the Jewish community than is true today. And now this brings me to the state of Israel. Not to discuss Israeli politics, but to discuss American Jewish attitudes towards it in terms of a crossroads. And again, I cite my own life because I think here I'm a datum in the lecture that I'm giving. I was born on November 21st, 1947. My mother tells me I had my Brit Milah on November, ritual of circumcision, probably more information than you need, on November 29th, 1947. That is an historic date in the history of the Jewish people. The 29th of November is when the United Nations voted to partition Palestine and allow the State of Israel to be created in May of that year. My life is coterminous with the life of the State of Israel. As a teenage boy, I remember thinking in 1967, at the beginning of June 6th, 7th, when the Six-Day War began, that the Jewish state was going to be destroyed. And I had that as a tremendous, tremendous fear. Israel was a David against a Goliath. It represented a place where millions of our people who died in the Holocaust would not have died had there been a Jewish homeland. The ties I have to the State of Israel cannot be exaggerated. I would estimate I have made over 100 trips to the State of Israel. I've lived there, taught at the Hebrew University. Israel is just part of my life, part of my very soul and being. I look now to my children. It is part of their life as well. All of my children went to Jewish parochial, Jewish day schools. Several of them speak Hebrew completely fluently. Their Israel is not my Israel. And I am just now trying to not speak autobiographically, but this is the challenge the Jewish community confronts. Israel is viewed critically by any number of younger Jews in the United States. Here I think particularly of the work of someone like a Peter Beinart, or a journalist, or a Noam Pianko, who teaches at the University of Washington. Peter Beinart wrote an article in the New York Review of Books a couple of years ago condemning the organized Jewish community for being completely supportive of Israeli foreign policy in regard to, and now I want to be very careful, Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories. Use whatever term, the West Bank, whatever you want to use. You should note that there is a debate going on in the American Jewish community. And if you want to talk about a crossroads, that represents a radical, radical break. For people of my age and older, and as you look out at this audience, those of you who are Jewish, I cannot imagine that your support for the State of Israel and all of its policies, or most of them, is not complete. And for other people, I can tell you that for our children and grandchildren, they don't share all of our, I'd call them non-critical attitudes towards Israel in regard to a whole host of issues. Where this plays itself out, and now I go back to the demography. In the recent election, approximately 70% of the Jewish community voted for Secretary Clinton. About 30% of the Jewish community voted for President Trump. The 70% of the Jewish community that voted for Secretary Clinton, virtually every reform, conservative, liberal Jew in this country voted for the Democratic Party. In the Orthodox community, the vote for President Trump was over 80%. And one of the major reasons for that was, quite frankly, what the Orthodox community regarded as President Trump's greater degree of sympathy for Israel than would be true of the Democratic Party. Now I am speaking as a lecturer, and we can talk about this afterwards. I am not here to either praise or condemn, but I want to say when you talk about American Judaism at a crossroads, part of what we see is that you had a community that was united in the 19th century. It was culturally homogeneous, divided but seeking acculturation, with divisions between Eastern European and German Jews, or Jews of Eastern European and Germanic descent. In the 20th century, the growth of denominationalism. And in the 21st century, you have a community that is more or less divided between Orthodox Jews on the one hand and non-Orthodox Jews on the other. And they have different attitudes towards religious observance. They have different attitudes towards elements of Israeli foreign policy. And these are differences that represent great, great challenges for the Jewish community as we go into the 21st century. The issue of intermarriage, by and large, the non-Orthodox community has begun to regard this as an opportunity. When someone intermarries, the real test is, will Judaism provide a sense of meaning for people so that they will raise their children and grandchildren with a sense of Jewish identity? For others in the Jewish community, it is a great crisis, and it represents an attenuation and a weakening of the community. Part of what I've tried to do then is to present a large overarching picture of many of the trends in the community. And let me conclude these remarks, and then hopefully we have some time for questions, with a rabbinic statement, not a sociological or academic one. One of my favorite essays is one written by a man named Shimon Ravidovich. If you spell it, you get 5 points on the exam. R-A-W-I-D-O-W-I-C-Z. Shimon Ravidovich. He was the first head of the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis University. Great, great, great scholar. He wrote a book entitled The Ever-Dying People. The Ever-Dying People. And Professor Ravidovich, in his survey of the totality of the Jewish experience, pointed out that in every generation almost, Jews thought, après moi le déluge, we are she'erita pleta, the Jewish community is going, as it were, to hell in a handbasket. We have so many problems. But he pointed out that because in every generation there were Jews who worried about how Jewish values, community, and identity would be conveyed to a subsequent generation, that there were people who acted in the world to see to it that Jewish existence continued. And that the converse is also true. To be ever dying is to be always alive. And in this sense, then, the Jewish community, for all of the challenges, problems, and complexities that mark it, has managed to survive and persist for quite literally thousands of years. Jewish identity, Jewish community, Jewish belief and religion has persisted. The part of me that is a rabbi thinks that it is because there is still a divine mission or challenge that God has posed to the Jewish people, and the Jews in every generation, in this one, in past ones, and in future ones, will continue to answer those challenges and provide new opportunities for Jewish meaning and identity. I hope that what I've been able to do, and in these, now I see close to 50 minutes, pay appropriate tribute to my friend, Rabbi Hillel Cohn, to talk about some of the directions and complexities that mark the community. I would hope that for all of you here, Jewish or non-Jewish, you understand that Jews, like any ethnic, racial, religious group, are really not homogeneous. There's a great degree of heterogeneity and a history of complexity that marks this community. The key thing about every ethnic or racial or religious group is that when you're not part of it, you tend to see it in monochromatic ways. But the reality is, and by the way, that's also why it's good. I often tell my students, don't learn more than 3 facts about anything, because then you're able to state things with incredible clarity. Once you begin to know something, there is infinite complexity and subtlety, and you have to be aware of it. And I hope that what I've been able to do tonight is to be able to define some of that complexity. And in this inaugural lecture, in the name of you, my friend, Rabbi Cohn, my friend and my teacher, I hope that this has paid appropriate tribute to you, because quite frankly, amidst all these complexities, and we did not discuss your own life's journey tonight, and where you and your father and mother, as refugees to this country from the horrors of Nazi Germany, how you were able to navigate that complexity in your own life and provide these opportunities of meaning for all of us who so admire and love you. So thank you all very much. questions? Yeah.
If this guy works.
So one of the things I hope is that we now have a question and answer session, although I know when I'm in many of these things, we tend to have answer and answer sessions. But if you have a question, I'm happy to try to handle it.
I'm a man with a microphone, so I'll start with you and work my way to the back. How about that?
I have a question because of what's been going on throughout the world, all of the anti-Semitism that we're
Yes.
seeing, and it's
Great.
it's so horrendous. I would really appreciate your perspective.
Okay, that is a great question. The issue of anti-Semitism in North America and throughout the world today. I will be honest with you, in this lecture, I purposely at this moment avoided it, but hoped that someone would speak about it. I would be a liar to say that I'm not mindful that I am standing here in San Bernardino, California. You had a tragedy that was exploited, in my view, shamelessly in the last election, though your community, from everything I understand, really joined together and reflected a kind of solidarity of which all of you can be very proud. There was a book written by a colleague of mine at UCLA a couple of years ago entitled How Jews Became White Folk, and What Does That Say About Race and Ethnicity in America? Well, there is a way in which we did become white folk. By that, I mean, all you have to do is look at these statistics in regard to exogamy. You do not get a high level of intermarriage for any minority group. I'm just reiterating what I said before. If members of the minority group are not accepted. Jews don't like to hear this because it's not our history. What's the history we learn? What's every Jewish holiday about? They tried to kill us. They failed. Hooray, let's eat. That is Jewish history. That's Jewish history. But the reality is, in the 1980s, a poll was taken. My colleague Bruce Phillips at Hebrew Union College and the University of Southern California, Gallup poll was taken of white Caucasian Americans. I guess if they're Caucasian, they're white. Caucasian Americans. The question was asked, how would you feel if your child married a Jew? I'd hate it. Wouldn't like it. It would be okay. Would be fine, though I wouldn't love it, or I'd love it. 22% of the people in this poll said, I would love it if my child married a Jew, and 64% said it would be fine with me. Only 14% said they would hate it or dislike it. Jews can't believe that because that's not the history we've grown up on. You also have a liberal tradition in America. There was, of course, social anti-Semitism. There's no question about it in the 40s and 50s. In my parents' generation, they were the children of immigrants. They did not intermarry. They did not because they had received, again in sociological terms, a taboo from their parents against outmarriage. But the reality is non-Jews wouldn't go out with them either. Jews didn't join non-Jewish fraternities, sororities. There was a kind of social segregation. That really did come to an end. America is really different. I think 2008, and now I'll speak for myself, but I also speak for my children. I have a child who said, oh, President Obama, he's the perfect representative of what the world is like now. Race really doesn't matter. Black mother, a black father, white mother, no one cares. He's just an American. We live in a world that's gone beyond race. That was 2008. Jews were thoroughly accepted. I am not attempting to be political here, though I imagine you can imagine where my own political sensibilities lie. So I'm going to try to give an answer that's as academic as I can. There has been, well, I'll just say what I think. There has been an expression of meanness in the highest realms of this country, discrimination, hatred, that really is almost unparalleled from the highest office in this country. I am not attempting to contend that any individual is necessarily anti-Semitic. In fact, if I were to mention that individual by name, I doubt that he is anti-Semitic. But he has unleashed, through his activities, to have a president of the United States who mocks a reporter with disabilities, who makes the comments about Muslims that this president makes, who allows Breitbart News to have the kind of role that it has now in American politics. Why should someone be surprised that 122 Jewish community centers received bomb threats, that the Hebrew Union College, again, where I'm Chancellor Emeritus, had swastikas drawn on it in Cincinnati, and that graves throughout the United States, 4 at least at this point, have been toppled. It doesn't mean that there's a huge Ku Klux Klan that's about to destroy America's Jews. But now, and I just speak for myself now, I do not speak as an academic. It really requires a different sociologist. I can't say that I have no anxiety about the United States any longer, though it extends beyond anti-Semitism. When I hear the President of the United States say millions of people, millions voted illegally, who were illegal immigrants here without any evidence to support that, when charges are made that the former President of the United States wiretapped the phones in his building with no evidence to support it. I do believe in American constitutional democracy, and I think we are a nation conceived in liberty, that however imperfectly we've realized it, I do think there is a liberal ethos that stands at the very heart of America. Rabbi Cohn was telling me today about a book that he was reading that was written prior to the Trump presidency that described what occurred in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, early 33, 34, before Kristallnacht and before death camps, etc. I'm not really worried about that. I am worried, though. I don't think I can say any longer that Jews are just white folk. I think American Jews now understand the kind of perils that our ancestors suffered in Europe. I think there is a degree of anxiety and insecurity that justifiably marks Jews in the United States today in a way that might not have been true 2, 3, and 4 years ago. And for members of other minority groups in this country, I suspect they have those anxieties even more. I have, at the Schusterman Center, one of our PhD students is a Pakistani woman. And it's interesting to me, she said that for a week after the election, she did not even call her parents, that they weren't able to talk to one another about what they thought this election meant for them. And I have students come into me at Brandeis who are from different countries, all of whom express anxieties that they frankly did not have before. I don't know what it is to be a Mexican at this point completely, though I can have empathy. So when you deal with this question of anti-Semitism, again, as I've tried to do in this lecture, I want to deal with it in a broader kind of way. I think there are anxieties Jews feel, even as I don't think there's going to be some great pogrom that's going to occur. We don't have political anti-Semitism at this point, but there have been forces of ugliness that have been unleashed in this country that I think it behooves all of us to pay attention to this as we move ahead. So those are my views on the issue. I didn't tell you everything, I think, but I came close.
Good evening, Rabbi. Thank you very much for your talk. I was fascinated by it. He really took my question, so I'll go another way. Today was National Women's Day.
Yes.
And in your talk, you mentioned that the Orthodox are going to be the great gainers of Jews. As a woman and as a dedicated Jew, I find it very difficult to go into an Orthodox synagogue where I'm told to sit upstairs or worse and don't shake my hand if they're Hasidim. It's very difficult for a woman, and I think it should make women a little nervous that we're sort of be going backwards.
Well, here, I mean, I do want to say, you know, in a way, the genie's been let out of the bottle. I mean, what was it I mean by that? So I talked about the changes that occurred between the French Revolution and the Congress of Vienna. The reality is the Congress of Vienna could not restore the world precisely as it was prior to the French Revolution. The ideas of emancipation and enlightenment had gained too much currency. The Orthodox community itself is highly diverse. Highly diverse. There is a yeshiva now, Yeshivat Maharat, that is ordaining Orthodox women as rabbis. There are record numbers of women who are now studying Talmud. If you are an Orthodox Jew, your belief is that the written and oral law, what we would call the Torah and the Talmud, were both revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. Classically, women were not permitted to study the Talmud. That is because classical Judaism, as is true of virtually every patriarchal tradition, and again I'll try to be descriptive, assigns positions of public power and authority to men and accords women positions of domestic honor. Trying to put this as neutrally as I can. With that said, in those assignment of gender roles, classically Rabbinic Judaism did not allow women to study Talmud. That has tremendous implications, though, as any student of gender would tell you, for issues of power and authority, particularly in the Orthodox world. If authority stems from knowledge of God's word, and you're not allowed to study it, then you cannot exercise power. What has begun to happen in Israel and the United States, there are any number of Orthodox women now who are engaging in the study of Talmud, and as they have done so, they have begun to have a much more significant voice. There is the, JOFA, I'm trying to think, the Orthodox Feminist of America. Blue Greenberg was the founder of this group. The Orthodox community is much more nuanced and layered, is what I want to say, than your comment might suggest. And the reality is that once you get to a country like the United States, where an ethos of women's equality is so ubiquitous, they're not going to put that genie completely back in the bottle again. So that I just want to assert that, at least in relationship to the women's issue, I think you're going to have expanded opportunities even in the Orthodox world over what might have been the case in years previously.
Rabbi, my name is Muhammad Zafarullah. I'm the Imam of Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I'm very thankful that you have briefly, I have learned a lot about the history of the America and the Jews. But my question is, go back to 2,000 years back. What is the concept of the Messiah in the Jewish tradition?
What's the function of the Messiah in the Jewish
Messiah, or
tradition?
what is the now is that is
Okay.
going to be?
Good. Okay, well, this goes back beyond North American Judaism. Christians often make mistakes in Western culture that they say Jews await a first coming while Christians await a second coming. That is somewhat correct, but it's somewhat incorrect. Christianity has a different view of messiahship than Judaism has. The Christian Messiah, Jesus, is the Christ. He is a homo deus. He is a man and he is God. That is the reason why, and correct me if I make a mistake here, Christianity can be called Christianity because the religion is given its name. Its name is taken from the Messiah. Christ is the Messiah. It would be a mistake to label Islam as Mohammedanism, because Muhammad, while the greatest prophet, is still a human being, a prophet. Similarly, it would be a mistake to call Judaism Mosaism, even though Moses is considered the greatest prophet. The Jewish Messiah is going to be, in Jewish tradition, a human being. not a god. The other difference is that in Christianity, and here you can read in Galatians and other places, think of John 3:16. God so loved the world, I didn't know I'd be quoting this tonight. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in him would gain life everlasting. Christ is the Paschal Lamb. Christ performs an expiatory function. Salvation is given you not because of deed. Abraham, as the Apostle Paul put it, is justified by faith, not by deed. Look in Acts and other parts of the New Testament. The Christian concept of messiahship is that Christ serves an expiatory function. That means your sins are forgiven you despite your activities. God loves you so much that he gave his only begotten Son, who died on the cross and suffered and was resurrected so that your sins would be forgiven and you would gain life everlasting. Your sins, it is an act of grace. Judaism does not have that concept in relationship to the Messiah. The Messiah does not serve an expiatory function. The Messiah will be a human being, not a man-God. And then there are debates in the tradition. Some people assert that the Messiah will come and usher in, but God will be the one, a final judgment. Other people say, the days of the Messiah won't be different than the days we have now, except that illness will disappear. Illness will disappear. The Jews will no longer be persecuted. Shibud Malchuyot is the Hebrew term. Jews will no longer suffer subjugation at the part of the non-Jewish world, but that the world as we know it will simply continue in many ways as it is now. There is a famous story in the Talmud that's told that there's a man who's planting a tree. And while he's in the midst of planting the tree, someone comes and says, "Stop planting, the Messiah has come." And the man says, "I think I'm going to keep planting. Because if the Messiah does come, well, then it would be wonderful. But if the Messiah has not come, then I won't have lost the time in planting a tree that will aid future generations." It represents a degree of skepticism. Jews always engage in what we call tikkun olam, repair or restoration of the world. The reality is that it's an ongoing goal, but probably never fully realized. I once went to a concert where I heard Arlo Guthrie sing. And Arlo Guthrie, who isn't Jewish, said he had learned about this Jewish concept, tikkun olam, and he couldn't sleep for a night or two because he kept thinking, repair the world, restore the world. And he thought, how am I going to restore the whole world? Look at the condition of the world. But then he said the third night he began to think about it, and he said, the world is really in pretty bad shape. Almost anything I do could actually make it better. So he said once he viewed it in that way, he found it a doctrine of great comfort. I am certain that there are Jews who believe fervently in a personal Messiah who will come in a supernatural way and change the world. I think for many of us, we would hope for that, but in the meantime, we'll keep, in quotes, planting our trees. Last question, comment?
We'll take one last question over here and then.
Okay.
Do you have any words of hope? What should we be doing? What can we do at this point? Are we condemned to 4 years of too many tranquilizers and too many sleep aids?
It's funny. I look at my friends, Sam the Cantor, Rabbi David Lazar, Rabbi Cohn. I don't know if my views are radically different, but I suspect all of us have comparable kinds of views in relationship to these questions. Last week, a synagogue that I belong to in New York, Congregation Rodef Sholem, had the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, a spokesperson, and an immigrant mother and her child from Afghanistan who spoke about their own experiences both fleeing Afghanistan and coming to the United States. This was a typical Friday night, and I would say at the synagogue I belong to, it's a large one. It draws normally about 300 to 400 people on a Friday night. It drew almost 1,200 people. It looked as if it were Yom Kippur. And I was talking to the senior rabbi there, Robert Levine. Part of why people were there was not only to hear from this woman and her child, but I think people actually want to do something. And what they did afterwards was they had tables where you could work with immigrants, you could work on issues of poverty, issues of reproductive rights. I mean, they had lots of tables, and people signed up for different activities. I do think there will be a greater degree of activism on many people's parts. I was asked recently to write an article for Cohn magazine, which is a progressive Jewish journal. I don't know, it amounts to like, what does the Trump presidency mean? And I'll tell you, I haven't written the article, but I haven't written the article not because I don't want to write it. I don't know what I would say that I don't know what I would say that would be original in any of this. And I go back to the words of just ki'ur, I mean ugliness. I don't know how else to say it. I still find it hard to believe that someone who displayed these qualities is the President of the United States. I mean, I say that not because I don't know necessarily what he actually believes, but again, I just think about every way. I mean, to attack Senator McCain as a loser because he was shot down and imprisoned, the Democrats made a gigantic mistake because I think many people felt what I just said right now. Not a question of policies, and this isn't, for me, Republican versus Democratic. It is the notion that the President of the United States is somehow a symbolic exemplar and sets a moral tone for our nation. And I think many of us thought that such a person who didn't represent that could be elected as President of the United States, but we were actually wrong about that, and that's something that I think a number of us need to think about. So I don't have a magic solution. There are political scientists and other people here who may have a better sense of what needs to be done, but this probably is not a time in which, it's a Hebrew phrase, shev al ta'aseh, sit and don't act. This is a time when kum aseh, it's probably time to get up and begin to act. I would say that the best thing you can do, in light of my previous comment, because this is a crossroads, is to pick an activity. There's another rabbinic phrase, lots of rabbinic phrases. Tafasta meruba lo tafasta. You try to do everything, you don't end up doing anything. Look at one issue that's of import to you and begin to participate in it. It won't change everything. It might not change even a great deal, but it may change something. And in this sense, then, the task that confronts all of us is how do you gather up these kinds of sparks so that holiness can once again appear in the world. I'll end with a rabbinic story. Why not? When I was a boy growing up, the ceremony that I liked the best in the Orthodox shul I grew up in was a ceremony. It was called duchenin. Duchenin is when the men who were Kohanim of priestly descent would come up to the front of the synagogue and they would recite the priestly benediction over the congregation. May God bless you and keep you. May God's countenance shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God's face be lifted up to you and may you know peace. When this ceremony takes place in an Orthodox synagogue, the Kohanim, the priests, go up and they cover their heads in prayer shawls, talesim. You actually cannot see them because their faces are covered. And when I was a boy, 8 or 9 years old, my father said, you are not permitted to look. You are not permitted to look because the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, comes into the community, and if you look, you'll be blinded. So my father, who was a graduate of William and Mary and Harvard Law School, this is what he told me. And he said, if you in fact look a second time, you'll not only be blinded, but you'll die. So when I was 8 or 9 and my father said this to me, I said, wait a minute. If I'm blinded the first time, how could I look the second time? And then I speak now as the father of 5. My father did what any parent would do on that occasion. He just put his hand over my mouth and said, shut up and turn around. I once shared this story with a friend of mine who's a rabbi in Jerusalem, Rabbi Levi Kelman. Rabbi Kelman's father, Wolf Kelman, was the head of the Conservative Rabbinical Assembly, one of the most powerful rabbis in the United States. Now, Rabbi Kelman and Levi, as a boy, went to synagogue where a man named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was in the synagogue. And Levi said his father had said to him, you can't look because you'll see God and that's forbidden, etc. So Levi, of course, looked and he said to his father, but I see. And then he named the men he knew in the congregation who were doing the blessing. And he said, so where is God? This is not an academic lecture at this point. I want to be clear. He said, where is God? And Rabbi Kelman Sr. said, that is a great question. But he had an advantage that my father didn't have. He said, that is a great question. Ask Rabbi Heschel. So I want to say, if you have any questions, David, I'll let you and Sam off the hook. Ask Rabbi Cohn if you have any questions. So Rabbi Heschel, and this is what Rabbi Heschel said to Levi. He said, Levi, if what you want to do is see God, you have to look in the mirror in the morning, but you have to look beyond your partsuf. You have to look beyond your physical face. And if you look deep within yourself, you'll see that there's a spark of God there. And when you see your father and your mother and your sisters, when you leave this synagogue and you walk on the streets of Broadway in Manhattan, every person who walks by you has that same spark within them. He said the problem, Levi, is that for most people, those sparks remain nistarim, they remain hidden. But what you have to do, Levi, is to behave in the world in such a way that you take those sparks that are hidden and you make them gluyim, you make them revealed in the world. I honestly and with my whole heart believe that educational institutions, religious institutions, at their best, this is really what it's about. What goes on in the humanities here? The reason why it wasn't enough to just read Plato and Aristotle in our previous curricula, and you should read Plato and Aristotle, is that if you want to understand how human beings construct meaning, you have to have the testimony of a lot of people. You have to have women, you have to have African Americans, you have to have Chinese, you have to have Mexicans, you have to have lots of people who can all contribute to an understanding of how meaning occurs in the world. And the same thing then is true of a religious institution. God manifests divinity in infinite ways. And in the end, God waits for you to act in the world in a way that that divinity can be manifest. I never imagined I would say that at the Hillel Cohn lecture, but I thank all of you for being here.
A couple of quick things. First of all, thank you so much, Rabbi Ellenson. It was a pleasure and an honor. And thank you, Rabbi Cohn, for being such a wonderful person that was capable of inspiring all of this. First of all, I have a couple of gifts for the both of you over here. I called them swag bags earlier and was told that I should call them something more professional than that, but I can't think of anything more professional at the moment. The other thing is I have a request for a photo with Rabbi Cohn, Rabbi Ellenson, with anyone who contributed to the endowment. anyone, whatever level at all. If you're willing to come down here and take a quick picture with the rabbis, we would appreciate it. Everyone else, you'll see what you're missing. So, feel free to give. But again, thank you both, but thank you, and drive safely going home. Good night.